Greetings from New York City. I just want to say that I'm calling in here from the unceded lands of the Lenape people. I acknowledge the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. And I make this acknowledgement as part of the work to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and white supremacy. So as Will mentioned in that nice introduction, I'm an objects conservator at the Metropolitan Museum, where I work predominantly with the Egyptian art collection, everything from tiny little amulets to, as you see, the Temple of Dender, and work on our museum's excavations. In 2019, curator Janice Cameron and I started a project to carry out an in-depth study of the late period coffins in our collection. When I originally signed on to do this project, I thought that by the time I'd be talking to you all, we'd have looked at loads of coffins and I'd have some profound takes or at least some general trends to note. But then, of course, the pandemic happened. And like everyone, we've had to adjust expectations. So the lofty title of this paper had to be revised a bit. And so instead, I'm just going to show you two coffins that I've had the privilege of studying, one from the collection of the Brooklyn Museum, and when I was a contract conservator there, and one from the Met's collection. The Brooklyn Museum coffin was presented during the Fitzwilliam Museum's coffin conference, and the Met's coffin was presented at last year's RC meeting. So apologies for any repeats for those of you who are at either of those events. I won't be directly comparing the two coffins, but my aim with this is to tell these really great stories that come along with these coffins and hopefully serve to illustrate some of the really fascinating questions that the study of these objects can raise. So the first coffin belongs to Pasiphae, the royal prince, Count of Thebes. The Brooklyn Museum has the outer coffin, the inner coffin, the mummy board, and the remains of the prince himself. The coffin is stylistically dated to the Third Intermediate Period, or Dynasty 21, which is so around 1075 to 945 BCE. In 2009, a sample of the linens from the mummy was sent to the University of Arizona for C14 analysis, which corroborates the stylistic date. The coffins and mummy of Pasiphae were in the de Potter collection prior to coming to the Brooklyn Museum. Armand de Potter claimed that the coffins were found in 1893 near Deir el-Bahri. De Potter was a Frenchman who immigrated to the United States and established a successful tourist agency which led tours to archaeological sites in Egypt and other places. And it was during these tours that he acquired antiquities and shops in Cairo and Upper Egypt. Just a little aside, the granddaughter of Armand and his wife Aimee recently published an adventure novel, which chronicles, with varying degrees of creative license, her grandparents' story, including the collecting story and her grandfather's disappearance at sea and all kinds of crazy things, which actually is true. And she even mentions our coffin several times in the highlighted sections. But anyway, I digress. After a stint at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago and a loan to the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the de Potter collection was sold by his widow to the Brooklyn Museum in 1908. My work on Pasiphae and its coffin was focused on the outer coffin, which was examined and treated in preparation for a loan show in 2015 and 2016. Like most large wooden objects from ancient Egypt, both the lid and the box are constructed from multiple pieces of wood, which have been mechanically joined with dowels and mortise and tenon joins, as you see in the detail images here. And I won't describe what these joins look like because most of you heard the great talk by Jeffrey last week. So in 1971, a Dr. Michaels of the Department of Physics at University of Pennsylvania took samples of the wood of the coffin. Apologies if you're horrified by the giant size of these holes that were bored into the bottom of the coffin, but there they are. And the wood was tentatively identified as cedar and acacia. And all of the samples were also used for carbon-14 testing, which dated the coffin to 1,000 years before the 21st dynasty. But knowing that carbon-14 dating was in its infancy in the early 70s and wanting to confirm the age of the coffin wood, in 2016, we took a new sample, this time less than 50 milligrams, so far more reasonable, and sent it to University of Arizona for testing. And the results indicate that at least some of the wood is indeed significantly older than the 21st dynasty. So this is no surprise, as reuse was not uncommon in that time in Egypt. And then also, interestingly, some red paint present on the butt edges of several of the wooden panels may confirm reuse as well. A textile layer is visible in many areas below the surface, adhered to the wooden substrate, and some areas of the substrate are coated or bulked with a tan-colored paste, which was identified as a mixture of kaolin, calcite, gypsum, and quartz. These materials, the textile and the paste, would have served to cover up gaps and even out joints prior to the application of surface decoration. And this is really just because this coffin was cobbled together from so many different pieces. And the exterior is decorated with gesso, polychromy, and varnish, which was identified as a natural tree resin. And in addition, a technique similar to pastilia has been applied to create subtle relief to the surface by applying some raised gesso decorations prior to painting. The interior of both the coffin lid and box are covered with a brittle black coating. Analysis indicates that the coating is a mixture of bitumen as well as possibly natural resin, oil, and wax. This mixture is something that we've colloquially been calling a black goo because it's present on a lot of funerary materials. And I'll return to this a little bit later with the second coffin I'm going to describe. But with this particular coffin, we also studied the pigments present and the array of restoration materials present. But I'm going to skip that part of the story for now and move on to something a bit more intriguing. A really interesting mystery surfaced when the coffin was traveling for loan back in 2007. A white efflorescence showed up on the surface of the modern fills. Samples were analyzed with microchemical spot testing, with negative results produced for every single test, and X-ray diffraction from all the samples analyzed produced uncertain results. When I took on this coffin as a project years later, the efflorescence had returned, and so we decided to revisit this mystery. So we did SEM analysis and found that these sort of little spherical efflorescence particles were actually composed of shard-like crystals, almost entirely of sodium oxygen and carbon. And we think actually, after some additional analysis, that these crystals are actually composed of natron, which is a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate decahydrate and sodium bicarbonate. And similar results were obtained with FTIR and Raman spectroscopy. All right, so what is natron doing fluorescing onto the surface of the coffin? Natron was used in mummification, glass and faience making, and other manufacturing processes. But its presence on the coffin matrix is still really unexplained. These salts are highly soluble, and it's possible they were solubilized inadvertently out of the wood when old plaster fills were removed back in 2007, as this was done by first softening the plaster with water-based poultices. If any moisture had remained in the wood, then when the new fill material was applied, it would have been pulled into the fill material along with the solubilized salts. But also fluctuating relative humidity while the object was in transit could have caused the salts to deliquesce, move up through the fill material, and then effloresce onto the surface of the fills on the coffin. But more importantly, besides the why of this, where does the natron come from? What's it doing in the coffin wood? And that's where a little bit of this is left up to the imagination. Were the boards once a part of an embalming table? You can come up with all kinds of theories. I don't think we'll ever really have the answer to this. Although if anyone has any good theories, other than mine of it being boards from a boat that sailed on Wadi Natroon, please let me know. Okay, so we'll leave that mystery there, and we're going to fast forward a couple of dynasties. And this is the coffin of Ankhsepen-wepet in the Metz collection, which is dated a few centuries later, 712 to 664 BCE. During the 1923 to 1924 season, the Metz Egyptian expedition under the direction of Herbert Winlock discovered a small tomb cut into the bedrock at the base of the northern enclosure wall of Hatshepsut's complex at Deir el-Bahri, right there, as you can see with the arrow. The tomb contained the burial of a singer of the residence of Amun named Ankhsepen-wepet, dating to the late 25th to early 26th dynasties. And here's just a drawing of the tomb chamber, a plan by Sarah Chen, our in-house artist. Most of the assemblage was scattered in the southern of the two chambers, with the lid and the outer coffin in the northern. The coffins had been rifled, and Ankhsepen-wepet's mummy had been removed. And here's just a quick shot of her tomb assemblage, seen here in archival images taken by Harry Burton. You can see the outer anthropoid coffin, the inner anthropoid coffin, Tasok or Osiris figure, shabti boxes containing mud shabtis, and dummy canopic jars. And there's also a naturally desiccated gazelle that was found at the foot of the coffin base between the two chambers. As always, there's way more story to tell here, but we're just going to focus on the inner coffin today. So visual examination revealed that the box was constructed from at least 9 separate wooden boards, and the lid from at least 13. There are no joins that are readily visible, and there may be some evidence of butt joining with smaller wooden dowels, but we'd have to do X-radiography to confirm this. The wood has not been previously identified, and we, just before the pandemic, had taken some samples and sent them to Caroline Cartwright, so we're awaiting the results of that analysis. The coffin has mortise and tenon enclosure with a single dowel locking mechanism. Some of the dowel holes go through the exterior surface layers, while others are covered with paste and paint, implying that the dowel was inserted before the surface was decorated, and I'll get back to that in a minute. A pinkish colored paste has been used to round out corners and fill gaps in the wood throughout the coffin. The same paste covers much of the wood as a preparation layer, on top of which a second whiter preparation layer makes a surface for painting. Textile was applied over much of the coffin, including the exterior sides of the box and the front and sides of the lid. Textile is not applied on the interior or over the lips of either the box or the lid. And all of the paste preparation layers are applied on top of the textile, just as with the coffin of Pasiphae-Nipit. Examination of the coffin structure also revealed some possible evidence of recycled materials. A board on the back of the box, as you can see on the image on the right, has a beveled edge, which might imply that at least this board was originally part of some different object. The liberal use of pinkish paste, also to fill in large gaps between the boards, could also suggest that these boards were originally made for another object, but poorly fitting seams don't necessarily imply reuse of materials. So here's a really interesting observation. The exterior decoration seems to have been applied after the coffin was closed, presumably with the mummy already inside. We suspect this because the textile, paste, and paint layers on the exterior extend across the seams of both the box and the lid. The decoration on the top of the head and the bottom of the foot also extend across the seam. This raises the question of whether the process of painting formed part of the embalming or funerary ritual. This may also connect to the process seen in earlier periods of for painting the cartonnage mummy cases, though thought also to have been decorated with the mummy inside. Drips in the paint can also tell us about the manipulation of the coffin during the painting process. Drips in the back of the box suggest that this area was decorated while the box was vertical, but drips and pooling paint, particularly Egyptian blue, on the sides, head end and foot end of both the box and the lid indicate that at least some paint was applied while the box was horizontal. And so this suggests that the coffin was rotated as needed to apply the paint even after closure, even with the mummified individual inside. We also did, and I'm not going to get into too much detail here, we also did a preliminary characterization of the pigments through a combination of imaging and elemental analysis. Multiband imaging was used to globally map the optical properties of different materials on the coffin surface under UV, IR, and visible light. And the images were compared with X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy results to facilitate preliminary pigment identification. For example, the yellow on the shoulder and the yellow in the background had varied responses under UV and IR, and they produced different XRF spectra, indicating the use of different yellow pigments. But nothing that we saw in the pigment analysis was particularly unusual. And here are just some results. And lastly, for this coffin, on the interior of the box, there are large deposits of a shiny black material. There was probably originally more evidenced by its presence around the edges of losses, but it was probably well adhered to the mummy and pulled away from the surface when the mummy was removed. Recent analysis of, again, here's these black goos, recent analysis at the British Museum and elsewhere has found complex mixtures that include some or all of the following: resins, pitch, plant oils, beeswax, and bitumen. And we're still awaiting the results of the analysis on our particular black goo here. But rather than, as in the case of Passamaquoddy and Ipit, where it coated the entirety of the interior of the coffin, this only occurs sort of right behind where the mummy would have been laid. So what was its purpose? Did it have a different purpose than the black goo in Passamaquoddy and Ipit's coffin? Did it serve to sort of affix the mummy in place while the coffin was being decorated? Again, these are questions we're just starting to explore and just starting to ask ourselves. So how these two coffins relate to the bigger picture is a subject for another lecture, obviously. But here are some main takeaways from these two preliminary investigations. So both coffins were made from many wooden boards of varying sizes, which is very, very typical of the time period. Both have at least some evidence for possible reuse, a much more strong case in Passamaquoddy and Ipit, but certainly at the very least that one board in Ankh-Shep and Wepit may have been reused or recycled. Textile and paste are used in both coffins to fill gaps and irregularities in the wood and to create a sort of nicer, smoother surface for the really fine decoration you find on both of these coffins. Both have some amount of this black goo, Passamaquoddy and Ipit again on the entire interior, and Ankh-Shep and Wepit just in a couple of spots on the interior. And then Passamaquoddy and Ipit has, his sort of weird natron mystery that we may never solve. And Ankh-Shep and Wepit has this really interesting detail that, about the fact that we think it was decorated well closed with the mummy inside. So, as any conservator will tell you, material narratives are often really complex and endlessly fascinating, and these two coffins are no exception. They both have great stories. And the stories they tell are totally intriguing, both about the individuals who are buried within and also their broader social context. And as always, the technical details we observed raise far more questions than they provide answers. And so that's all I have here, but I would love to hear any questions or feedback or, hey, I saw something similar from anyone. But I guess now at this point, I will turn it over to Cristina.
Okay, thank you, Will. Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to share with you the results of this work that I did in 2015 while I was spending 6 months of a postdoc in Cairo. And I had a project on glass in the Egyptian Museum, but while I was there, my attention was catched by this incredible coffin. So I quickly wrote a short application asking the permits to spend a few time observing this coffin and doing some documentation. And with great joy, I got the permit for spending a couple of hours looking at the coffin without the showcase and taking some documentation. So here is the coffin in the display of the Egyptian Museum. And today I will discuss with you a few aspects. I will start from a few aspects related to the making of the coffin. I will touch very briefly the description of the support, and then I will go to polychromy, and we will discuss in detail the way it was painted, the way it was gilded, and I will focus on the way of painting the skin tones and on the meaning of color, what's the added meaning, what's the meaning which is added by the polychromy in this coffin. The coffin was published in the 1905 catalogue of Greco-Egyptian coffins in the Egyptian Museum. And in the catalogue is said to come from the Serapeum of Saqqara. The same provenance is in the registers of the Egyptian Museum, but I can tell you that this is not the correct find spot for this object, because in 1994, the archive of the archaeologist Luigi Vassalli was published. Luigi Vassalli was an Italian Egyptologist who spent part of his life in Egypt during the second half of the 19th century. And he was inspector of the antiquities under Mohammed Said Pasha, and later he became one of the assistants of Auguste Mariette. And he also became curator at the Bulaq Museum. The Bulaq Museum was the first archaeological museum of Cairo before the Egyptian Museum was built. And in the year of the discovery, in 1854, he gave a lecture at the Italian Archaeological Institute about the discovery of this coffin. And he said that the Greek coffin in sycamore wood found in the cemetery of Saqqara along the alley of the Sphinx, described by Strabo, more precisely halfway north and south. So the right find spot is not the Serapeum, which is here, but it's the alley of the Sphinx. So this is a coffin coming from the cemetery. And in his talk, Vassalli discussed the quite peculiar iconography of the sirens decorating the coffin. And he noticed a similarity with the statue of the siren excavated a few years ago in the Serapeum of Saqqara. And I will come back to this subject at the end of the talk. Going to the material aspects, this is a wood coffin, but it's also a multi-material object. It was made joining different elements of wood. In the 1905 catalogue, there is quite an accurate description of all the technical aspects and woodworking. I would only say that the identification of the wood species would be very useful here, because I'm quite sure it's not made of a sycamore wood, or at least not only. So this is the view from the side, the front, the back, and the details. We start approaching to give a close look to this coffin. As you can see, there are parts which have been painted, parts where the wood is left bare. And thanks to the description and the documentation of Vassalli, we can say this bare surface was bare at the time of the discovery, and we have reason to think that the part of the wood of the coffin was visible. We can see here and there the tool mark. It's very clear that the turning wheel was used to work some parts of the coffin, and this is not surprising because we are for sure during the 4th century. What I find very interesting is the combination of wood with different materials, because we have an extensive use of terracotta applique, molded stucco, and gypsum, which has been worked freehand. These are the applique we can find at the corner of the shoe pediments of the coffin, and are made of terracotta. And we know similar applique from a number of Egyptian sites, especially from Naucratis. Several appliques from Naucratis are at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, others are at the British Museum. What is exceptional here is that we can see them in their original position. The two sirens are made in terracotta, but the acanthus shrub is gypsum, is molded gypsum. The point of the legs are freehand worked, while the rest of the body, the head and the wings, are made in terracotta. It's not a unique mold, but we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 parts which have been joined together. The two sirens are very similar, but not identical, which means they've been made using 2 different molds. From a close look, you can appreciate very clearly the differences. Look at here in the arm, the position of the head, which is quite different. The decoration, this is a low relief created applying what we would call a pastilla. It's a mixture of gypsum and animal glue applied by brush to create volume. You can see very well the dots here and the lines accompanying the pastilla with a pointed brush. This is a work you can easily do with a small pointed brush. And also the motif of darts and eggs is made in the same way. There is this play of illusion between the tridimensionality of painting and the volume of pastilla here. You can appreciate better the volume here in this photograph. The same technique, the same method was used for applying the borders, the raised borders of the meander and the raised waves. Gilding, I'm starting with gilding, but gilding was actually not the first passage of the decoration, but it happened partly at the end, partly before painting some details of the decoration. And we find 2 different ways of gilding: polishing, and we have gilded details which have been polished and gilded details which have not been polished. You can see clearly that all the polishing is here on the meander and on the waves. How gold was applied? It was applied, of course, first of all the painted surface is on a white background. This is probably a mixture of gypsum with an organic medium, probably glue. It's necessary for creating a surface which is not too porous, so it's very convenient for painting. And so this white layer is the preparation. The second layer that you can see here is this yellow layer. This is the bolus. It's the preparation for applying the gold foil. The bolus is a clay-based material which is very sticky and is used for gilding. After applying the bolus, you can see the rest of the decoration was painted, and in fact this red field is on top of yellow. And after that, we have the application of the blue field. In the pastilla details of the flowers in the central part and also on the terracotta applique, the gold foil is not polished. You can see very well this quite gritty texture. This is what you achieve when you pass a wet brush on the bolus to reactivate the bolus, and then you apply the golden foil and you just push it with a soft cloth. The same here, we are on the flowers, and the same here on the tendrils. You can see very well that here the application of gold was the last passage. But if we go on the borders, we have a different technique and a different sequence, because here the foil is very shiny, and we have not that grittiness we saw before, and we also see some lines. These are the polishing lines left by the passage of the polishing stones. So the effect was more soft in the figures and more sharp on the geometric details. It's very nice to notice that this intense blue, which is clearly Egyptian blue, because we can't be mistaken with this kind of grains, was painted at the end. It's the last passage. I suspect the reason of this sequence is because for polishing you need to have a very clean bolus. And if a grain of Egyptian blue goes on the bolus, you risk to compromise the final effect, because when you polish, you risk to break the foil and you ruin your gilding. So probably for me, this is the reason for this final layer of the thick Egyptian blue was painted at the end. So it's the last passage of the decoration. Again, on the waves, we can see very well the same. And we go to painting. Painting was very, so all the coffin is painted in a very accurate way. And I would much like to analyze one day this brownish color, because if we look at this color with a microscope, we can see that this is the result of an alteration of probably an organic varnish or resin. And this resin, this layer, was applied before painting the last details of the flowers, because we can see that the pink or the blue and the white are on top of this layer, and we can see what is behind this green light blue color, where the grains of Egyptian blue are very clear. It's also interesting to see that the pigments were mixed for achieving the shades. For example, in this pink violet, we see some grains of Egyptian blue. Flashy tones were painted with great care, and I'm always very interested to the way flashy tones were created, because there is always a lot of debate, especially for sculpture, how flashy tones were created. If we look at the Medusa heads, we can see that the flashy tones are not painted all in one time, but they were built gradually. We see this lighter background and then a second layer here, which is slightly darker. Some pink color inside the lips. And the color, the shade is corrected again by the addition of a few Egyptian blue. If we go to the body of the sirens, we see a further detail, because there is some pinkish color applied all over the body and on the cheeks. So again, like in the Medusa heads, we have this white background, a darker color under the eyes, and then we have all this very liquid pink color for creating volume and to give this impression of blushing. This is quite curious. One of the two sirens has a tiny detail in gold at the center of the lips. So I think this detail of blushing is very interesting for understanding those images, because blushing was something quite recent at the time. Because if we look at sources, the idea of blushing, the idea of redness, is an Hellenistic invention. If we go to the archaic times, strong emotions are always related to losing color or to become green. This becoming red is a novelty of the Hellenistic period and will become a topos of Alexandrian novels. It's a phenomenon typical of lovers, especially if they are young, both men and women, and has a very strong erotic connotation. So why sirens should blush? Who are the sirens? We know sirens are mythical creatures, half bird, half human, usually female, but not always, as you can see here. And if we read the last chapter of Plato's Republica, in the description of the structure of the universe, the sirens are playing the sound of the created by the movement of the universe. So they are celestial creatures. And being winged creatures, they are also in charge of accompanying the souls to the afterlife, which is exactly the function of the Egyptian bird. In Greek funerary art, sirens are quite common, but they are always very different from our Saqqara sirens, because the Greek sirens are always weeping and very serious figures. The Saqqara type is very different, and I invite you to observe the position of the body. Crossed legs, the reclining head, and this curved shape of the body. This is what we find in the contemporary representation of dancing. This is a terracotta figurine from the slopes of the Acropolis of Athens with a dancing, probably a dancing nymph. So this idea of dancing and music associated to a lavish vegetal background is exactly what we find in the contemporary ceramics of the Ignazia group, where female beautiful sirens or Venus herself is dancing in a promise of renaissance, a regeneration. We have to remember the success in Egypt of mysteric cults and of Orphic religions. So it's very likely that this kind of representation is associated to this kind of funerary practices. This erotic connotation of sirens was probably so well known that we find even a parodistic passage in the 3rd century B.C. where sirens are considered like prostitutes who will steal the money to their clients. And again, for closing, we look at those curious details, of the gilding at the center of the lips. It might be something not intentional, but I'm not that sure, because in Egyptian funerary art, gilding is very important, especially for creating flashy tones. So we are again talking about how to represent skin. In Egypt, the skin of the goth is made with golden foil, and during the Hellenistic period, we know a series of mummy cartonnage with the golden faces, with the golden skin. And again, if those sirens are in some way connected to mysteric cults, we have to remember that in Orphic mysteries, gold foils with magical inscriptions were placed on the mouth of the deceased. And we also remember that a few months ago in Egypt, there was a Tapsosiris mania, a mummy with a very peculiar amulet was found. This mummy had a golden tongue inside the mouth. So this tiny golden dot might recall some funerary practices that we don't know well and we should study more in detail. So thank you very much. And of course, as always, I thank my sponsor, the Alidriz's Erasmus Mundus program, and the Egyptian Museum with the director and the staff.